"Get out of my way, cleaning lady!" Dr. Marcus Sterling's voice boomed through Sterling Memorial Hospital's marble lobby as he shoved the elderly black woman holding a mop bucket. "This is a restricted area for medical personnel only." The 71-year-old woman stumbled backward, her cleaning supplies scattering across the polished floor as Sterling knocked her against the reception desk. Security guards looked away. Nurses pretended not to see. The woman's medical files scattered from her bag, revealing patient charts and pharmaceutical records. "I said move!" Sterling shouted, standing over her as she gathered the scattered documents. "Learn your place in my hospital." But as Dr. Sarah Williams slowly rose to her feet, adjusting her janitor's uniform, something in her calm expression made Sterling's confident smirk falter. The files she were collecting weren't cleaning schedules. They were FDA violation reports. 47 patient deaths, 32 covered-up malpractice cases, 18 forged medical licenses. And the woman Sterling had just assaulted, she wasn't a cleaning lady. She was the former chief of internal medicine, who had been working undercover for 6 months, documenting the medical fraud that would destroy Sterling's entire operation. Sterling had no idea he'd just committed felony assault against the one person with the medical credentials and federal connections to expose the largest medical malpractice cover-up in Chicago. Sterling Memorial Hospital stood like a monument to medical excellence on Chicago's Gold Coast, its 20-story glass facade reflecting the morning sun across Lake Michigan. The building housed some of the most expensive medical equipment in the Midwest, attracted the wealthiest patients from across the country, and generated over $200 million in annual revenue. But beneath its pristine exterior lay a corruption so systematic and deadly that it would ultimately destroy hundreds of families and claim dozens of innocent lives. Dr. Sarah Williams adjusted her janitor's uniform as she moved through the restricted pharmaceutical storage area, her practiced movements betraying none of the medical expertise that had earned her recognition as one of Chicago's most respected internal medicine specialists. At 71 years old, with 4 decades of medical experience and a spotless reputation that included service as chief of internal medicine at University Hospital for 22 years, she should have been enjoying retirement at her lake house in Michigan. Instead, she was documenting crimes that would expose Sterling Memorial as the most dangerous hospital in American history. The disguise had been her own idea, born from months of frustration with traditional investigative approaches that had failed to penetrate Sterling Memorial's sophisticated system of corruption and intimidation. Federal investigators from the Department of Health and Human Services had been trying to build a case against Sterling Memorial for 18 months, but every witness who came forward either disappeared, suddenly recanted their testimony, or found themselves facing mysterious lawsuits that drained their resources and destroyed their careers. Hospital administrators had perfected the art of making problems disappear, and their methods went far beyond simple legal intimidation. Dr. Williams had watched talented physicians lose their licenses on fabricated charges of prescription drug abuse and patient negligence. She had seen nurses transferred to dangerous assignments in understaffed units after reporting safety violations that could have saved patient lives. She had witnessed entire departments restructured to silence whistleblowers, with good doctors replaced by compliant ones who understood that asking questions was a career-ending mistake. The hospital's power extended into the Medical Licensing Board, the State Health Department, and even the local district attorney's office, creating a web of corruption that seemed impossible to penetrate through conventional means. But a cleaning lady? Nobody noticed cleaning ladies. They moved through restricted areas without question, overheard conversations that weren't meant for outside ears, and had access to documents that revealed the true scope of Sterling Memorial's criminal enterprise. Medical professionals spoke freely around service workers, treating them as invisible fixtures rather than potential witnesses to criminal activity. Dr. Williams had spent 6 months perfecting her cover, learning the janitorial schedules, memorizing the security protocols, and building relationships with the real cleaning staff who had become her allies in documenting systematic medical fraud. The morning of her confrontation with Dr. Sterling, she had been collecting evidence from the pharmaceutical storage room where expired medications were being relabeled with new dates and sold to patients at full price. The markup on new drugs that were actually past their expiration dates generated an additional $12 million in annual revenue while putting patients at risk of treatment failures, adverse reactions, and death from medications that legitimate hospitals would have safely disposed of months or years earlier. Her hidden camera had captured Sterling himself, directing technicians to change expiration dates on chemotherapy drugs that had been sitting in storage for over 2 years. Cancer patients were receiving treatments that were not only ineffective but potentially toxic, paying premium prices for medications that could cause more harm than their original conditions. The systematic nature of this fraud suggested that Sterling Memorial viewed patients not as human beings deserving of care, but as revenue streams to be exploited until they died. What Dr. Williams discovered next would shock even experienced federal investigators, who thought they had seen the worst of medical corruption. The evidence folder hidden beneath Dr. Williams' cleaning cart contained documentation of systematic patient abuse that went far beyond expired medications and represented the most comprehensive medical murder conspiracy ever documented in American healthcare. Sterling Memorial had developed what internal documents referred to as revenue optimization protocols, medical procedures designed not to heal patients, but to maximize billing opportunities while minimizing the hospital's legal liability through carefully orchestrated patient deaths that appeared to be natural complications of serious medical conditions. The cardiac surgery department, led by Dr. Sterling's longtime associate, Dr. Robert Chen, had been performing unnecessary heart procedures on elderly patients with substantial insurance coverage and significant personal assets. The surgeries were complex enough to justify charges exceeding $200,000 per patient, but were often deliberately complicated to create life-threatening conditions that required extended hospital stays, generating additional revenue streams, while the patients slowly died from preventable infections and surgical complications that were actually caused by intentional medical negligence. Dr. Williams had discovered that Sterling Memorial maintained 2 sets of medical records for these patients: the official records that showed aggressive treatment for complex cardiac conditions with unfortunately tragic but medically unavoidable complications, and the internal records that documented the deliberate creation of complications to extend profitable hospital stays until patient deaths eliminated the possibility of malpractice complaints or demands for financial restitution. The death rate for cardiac patients at Sterling Memorial was 43% higher than the national average, but the hospital's billing department celebrated the cardiac surgery division as their most profitable unit, with department heads receiving substantial bonuses for maintaining high patient mortality rates that maximized revenue collection while minimizing long-term liability exposure. The oncology department operated an even more sinister scheme that represented perhaps the most heartless abuse of vulnerable patients in medical history. Cancer patients who showed signs of remission or successful treatment were subjected to unnecessary additional chemotherapy cycles that often proved fatal, while healthy individuals who came in for routine screenings were told they had aggressive forms of cancer that required immediate and extensive treatment that would ultimately kill them. Dr. Margaret Foster, the hospital's chief of oncology, had been systematically falsifying cancer diagnoses to justify expensive treatment protocols for patients who didn't actually have cancer, using her position and reputation to convince families that their loved ones were dying from aggressive cancers when they were actually being slowly murdered through chemotherapy and radiation treatments that caused permanent damage to their immune systems and internal organs. The internal motto documented in emails between department heads was, "Dead patients can't complain about billing errors," a phrase that revealed the calculating cruelty behind Sterling Memorial's systematic patient abuse. Families grieving the loss of loved ones rarely questioned medical bills that arrived months after funeral services, especially when those bills were accompanied by carefully crafted condolence letters that praised the heroic efforts of Sterling Memorial's medical team in fighting, unfortunately, terminal conditions. By the time these patients realized they had been misdiagnosed, they had already been subjected to chemotherapy and radiation treatments that caused the very symptoms and complications they had been told were evidence of their original cancer diagnoses. The circular nature of this abuse meant that patients died from the treatments designed to cure diseases they never actually had. The pediatric ward represented perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Sterling Memorial's criminal enterprise, where children from low-income families were subjected to experimental procedures that had never been approved by the FDA. Their parents coerced into signing consent forms they couldn't read or understand through deliberate intimidation tactics that played on their desperation to help their sick children. The hospital received substantial payments from pharmaceutical companies for conducting these illegal human trials, while the children suffered from side effects that would affect them for the rest of their lives if they survived the experimental treatments at all. Many didn't. The mortality rate for pediatric patients at Sterling Memorial was 67% higher than the national average, a statistic that should have triggered immediate federal investigation, but was instead covered up through falsified mortality reporting and the systematic intimidation of families who demanded answers about their children's deaths. But the evidence that would ultimately destroy Sterling Memorial was still being compiled in Dr. Williams's secret investigation, and what she found would prove that the corruption extended far beyond the hospital itself. Dr. Williams' investigation had revealed that Sterling Memorial's corruption extended far beyond the hospital itself, involving a network of medical professionals, government officials, pharmaceutical companies, and organized crime figures that worked together to suppress evidence of systematic patient abuse, while maximizing profits from human suffering through a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Chicago's medical and political establishment. The Illinois State Medical Board, responsible for licensing and oversight of medical professionals throughout the state, had been compromised by Sterling Memorial's influence for over a decade through a sophisticated system of bribery, intimidation, and professional retaliation. Board Chairman Dr. Timothy Walsh received substantial consulting fees from pharmaceutical companies that conducted illegal human trials at Sterling Memorial, creating a financial incentive to ignore safety violations and suppress whistleblower complaints that could have exposed the hospital's criminal activities years earlier. When Dr. Williams had first attempted to report Sterling Memorial's crimes through official channels 3 years earlier, her complaint had been forwarded directly to Dr. Walsh, who immediately shared her allegations with Sterling Memorial's legal department in violation of patient confidentiality laws and whistleblower protection statutes. Within 48 hours, Dr. Williams found herself facing a professional conduct investigation based on fabricated allegations of patient abuse and prescription drug diversion that could have destroyed her medical license and ended her career. The investigation had been orchestrated by Sterling Memorial's chief legal counsel, Patricia Monroe, who specialized in destroying the careers of medical professionals who threatened the hospital's profitable operations through a sophisticated system of character assassination, financial intimidation, and professional sabotage. Monroe maintained files on dozens of physicians and nurses throughout the Chicago medical community, documenting personal information, financial difficulties, family problems, and professional vulnerabilities that could be weaponized against potential whistleblowers. Dr. Williams had discovered these files during one of her late-night evidence-gathering sessions, finding her own name at the top of a list labeled Priority Elimination Targets. The file contained photographs of her grandchildren taken without her knowledge, copies of her financial records obtained through illegal means, and detailed plans for destroying her professional reputation through false allegations of dementia and professional incompetence that would have made her testimony inadmissible in any legal proceeding. The corruption network also included Cook County District Attorney Michael Rodriguez, who received substantial campaign contributions from Sterling Memorial's board of directors in exchange for refusing to prosecute medical malpractice cases involving the hospital, regardless of the strength of evidence or the severity of patient abuse. Rodriguez's office had dismissed over 200 criminal complaints against Sterling Memorial physicians without conducting meaningful investigations, classifying obvious cases of medical murder as tragic but unavoidable complications of complex medical care, despite clear evidence of deliberate patient abuse. Sterling Memorial's influence extended into the Chicago Police Department through Detective Captain Lisa Thompson, who ensured that suspicious deaths involving Sterling Memorial patients were never thoroughly investigated through a system of evidence suppression, witness intimidation, and investigative sabotage. When family members demanded autopsies or independent medical examinations, their requests were delayed, denied, or simply ignored until statutes of limitations expired and legal action became impossible. The hospital's corruption network also included connections to organized crime families that specialized in medical billing fraud and identity theft operations. Patient information stolen from Sterling Memorial's databases was sold to criminal organizations that used the identities to bill Medicare and private insurance companies for medical services that were never provided, while prescription medications obtained through fraudulent prescriptions were resold on the black market, generating additional revenue streams for the criminal network. Sterling Memorial had also developed partnerships with corrupt nursing homes and assisted living facilities that served as patient acquisition sources for the hospital's profitable murder schemes. Elderly patients with substantial assets were systematically transferred to Sterling Memorial for specialized care that primarily consisted of unnecessary procedures designed to drain their financial resources before they died from deliberate medical complications. The systematic nature of the corruption was about to be exposed through Dr. Williams' methodical documentation, but what she didn't know was that federal investigators had been watching Sterling Memorial for months. Dr. Williams' evidence had ultimately reached the FBI through her former colleague, Dr. Maria Santos, who worked as a consultant for the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, and had been conducting her own investigation into Medicare fraud at Chicago area hospitals when she noticed the unusual billing patterns and mortality rates associated with Sterling Memorial that suggested systematic patient abuse on an unprecedented scale. The federal investigation had been running parallel to Dr. Williams' undercover work for 4 months, with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh coordinating surveillance operations and evidence collection through a joint task force that included investigators from the Department of Health and Human Services, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Internal Revenue Service. Agent Walsh had been building cases against medical fraud networks for 8 years, but Sterling Memorial represented the most systematic and deadly conspiracy she had ever encountered in her law enforcement career. The FBI's technical surveillance team had been monitoring Sterling Memorial's digital communications through court-authorized wiretaps and computer surveillance, discovering that hospital administrators used encrypted messaging systems to coordinate their criminal activities and share information about potential threats to their operations. The digital evidence revealed the true scope of Sterling Memorial's network, which included partnerships with fraudulent medical device companies, illegal pharmaceutical importation schemes, and connections to organized crime families that specialized in medical billing fraud and identity theft operations. Agent Walsh had been particularly shocked by Sterling Memorial's patient acquisition protocols, which involved targeting vulnerable populations through deceptive advertising campaigns and partnerships with corrupt nursing homes that served as feeders for the hospital's profitable murder schemes. Elderly patients with substantial assets were systematically transferred to Sterling Memorial for specialized care that primarily consisted of unnecessary procedures designed to drain their financial resources before they died from complications that were actually caused by deliberate medical negligence. The federal investigation had also uncovered Sterling Memorial's role in a national medical identity theft operation that extended far beyond Chicago and involved hospitals in 6 different states. Patient information stolen from Sterling Memorial's databases was sold to criminal organizations that used the identities to bill Medicare and private insurance companies for medical services that were never provided, generating millions of dollars in fraudulent revenue, while patients remained unaware that their medical identities had been compromised. The stolen identities were also used to obtain prescription medications that were resold on the black market, creating additional revenue streams for the criminal network, while putting legitimate patients at risk when they attempted to fill prescriptions for medications that had already been fraudulently obtained using their personal information. Dr. Williams' undercover work had provided the federal investigators with real-time intelligence about Sterling Memorial's daily operations, allowing them to document crimes as they occurred and build cases that would withstand scrutiny in federal court. Her medical expertise had been invaluable in helping FBI agents understand the technical aspects of the medical fraud and patient abuse they were documenting, translating complex medical procedures into evidence that could be understood by prosecutors and juries. The federal investigation had also revealed that Sterling Memorial's corruption extended to medical device companies that paid substantial bribes to hospital administrators in exchange for exclusive contracts to supply equipment that was often defective or inappropriate for patient care. These devices were deliberately selected not for their medical effectiveness, but for their potential to cause complications that would require extended hospital stays and additional procedures. Agent Walsh had been coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to track Sterling Memorial's connections to overseas pharmaceutical suppliers who provided expired and counterfeit medications that were relabeled and sold to patients at premium prices. The international scope of the conspiracy suggested that Sterling Memorial was part of a global network of medical fraud that involved hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and organized crime groups across multiple countries. The confrontation between Dr. Sterling and Dr. Williams was about to trigger the final phase of the federal investigation, but first, Sterling Memorial's daily operations would continue to claim more innocent lives. What happened next would change everything you thought you knew about hospital safety. The scattered medical files that Dr. Williams was collecting from the marble floor contained evidence that would destroy not only Dr. Sterling's career, but the entire Sterling Memorial Medical Network through documentation of crimes so systematic and deadly that they would ultimately lead to the largest medical fraud prosecution in American history. As hospital security guards and nursing staff watched nervously, Dr. Williams methodically gathered documents that contained patient death records, falsified medical licenses, pharmaceutical distribution records, and correspondence with organized crime figures that proved systematic violations of federal drug trafficking, racketeering, and murder statutes. Dr. Sterling's face had gone pale as he began to recognize some of the documents that had spilled from Dr. Williams' bag, particularly the FDA violation reports that contained his signature, authorizing the distribution of expired chemotherapy drugs to cancer patients, and the patient death records that showed mortality rates that were statistically impossible unless patients were being deliberately killed through medical negligence or intentional harm designed to maximize billing revenue while minimizing long-term liability exposure. "Who the hell are you?" Sterling demanded, his voice cracking with the first hint of fear as he realized that the woman he had just assaulted possessed detailed knowledge of his criminal activities and had been documenting his crimes with the thoroughness of someone who understood both medical procedures and legal evidence requirements. Cleaning ladies don't carry federal investigation files or know about pharmaceutical distribution protocols. Dr. Williams continued collecting her papers with methodical precision, her movements betraying the decades of medical training that had taught her to remain calm under pressure while making life-and-death decisions in emergency situations. When she finally looked up at Sterling, her expression carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent 40 years saving lives and had now dedicated herself to stopping those who destroyed them for financial gain. "My name is Dr. Sarah Williams," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hospital lobby as security guards, nursing staff, and administrative personnel strained to hear every word of what they sensed was a historic confrontation. "I served as Chief of Internal Medicine at University Hospital for 22 years before I retired. I've been working undercover in this hospital for 6 months, documenting the systematic murder of patients for financial gain." The revelation hit Sterling like a physical blow, causing him to stagger backward as he processed the implications of what he had just heard. Hospital staff members who had been pretending not to notice the confrontation suddenly found themselves unable to look away, as they understood that they were witnessing the exposure of crimes they had either participated in, enabled through their silence, or failed to report despite having knowledge of patient abuse that violated every principle of medical ethics. The cleaning lady they had ignored for months, treating her as an invisible fixture in their daily routines, was actually one of Chicago's most respected physicians, and she had been gathering evidence of crimes that would ultimately destroy their careers, end their freedom, and expose the systematic perversion of medical care that had turned their hospital into a murder factory disguised as a healing institution. Sterling's initial shock quickly transformed into rage as he realized the extent to which his operations had been infiltrated and documented by someone with both the medical expertise to understand his methods and the investigative skills to compile evidence that would be admissible in federal court. His voice rose to a shout that echoed through the marble lobby, carrying to patients, visitors, and staff members throughout the building. "You have no authority in this hospital. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Security, arrest this woman immediately for theft of confidential medical records." But the security guards hesitated, uncertain about their legal authority to arrest someone who claimed to be conducting a federal investigation and who clearly possessed extensive knowledge of medical procedures and legal protocols. Dr. Williams used their uncertainty to her advantage, pulling out her phone and speed-dialing a number that connected her directly to FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had been monitoring the situation from a surveillance van parked outside the hospital. "Agent Walsh," Dr. Williams said clearly, ensuring that her words carried to everyone in the lobby while maintaining the calm, professional demeanor that had characterized her entire medical career. "This is Dr. Williams. Doctor. Sterling has just committed felony assault against a federal cooperating witness. I'm requesting immediate backup and arrest authorization for multiple federal charges including conspiracy, racketeering, and murder." The mention of federal law enforcement sent shockwaves through the hospital lobby, as staff members realized that they were witnessing not just a personal confrontation, but the beginning of a federal criminal investigation that would ultimately expose Sterling Memorial as the center of the largest medical fraud and patient abuse conspiracy in American history. The federal law enforcement response was about to transform Sterling Memorial from a hospital into a crime scene, but Dr. Williams wasn't finished revealing the evidence she had compiled. While Dr. Sterling stood frozen in disbelief, his confidence shattered by the realization that his assault victim was actually a federal cooperating witness with decades of medical expertise. Dr. Williams began systematically presenting evidence that painted a picture of medical fraud so extensive and deadly that it defied comprehension and challenged everything that patients and families believed about hospital safety and medical ethics. The documents she had been collecting weren't random files scattered by accident. They represented 6 months of methodical evidence gathering that would serve as the foundation for federal prosecutions involving dozens of medical professionals, hundreds of victim families, and criminal charges that could result in life sentences for the most serious offenders involved in Sterling Memorial's systematic patient murder conspiracy. The pharmaceutical record showed that Sterling Memorial had been importing expired medications from overseas suppliers with connections to organized crime networks, relabeling them with false expiration dates, and selling them to patients at premium prices that generated over $15 million in annual revenue, while patients suffered treatment failures, adverse reactions, and death from medications that should have been destroyed years earlier, according to federal safety regulations. Dr. Williams pulled out her tablet, which contained digital copies of email communications between Sterling Memorial administrators and pharmaceutical company executives that had been captured through her covert surveillance operations. The emails revealed a systematic conspiracy to use Sterling Memorial patients as unwilling subjects in illegal drug trials, with pharmaceutical companies paying substantial fees for access to patient populations who had never consented to experimental treatments and were unaware that they were being used as human test subjects. "Dr. Sterling," Dr. Williams said, consulting her digital files with the practiced precision of someone who had spent months compiling evidence for federal prosecution, "I have recordings of you personally authorizing the use of expired chemotherapy drugs on cancer patients who trusted you with their lives. I have video footage of you directing technicians to change expiration dates on medications that had been stored improperly for over 2 years. I have documentation showing that you personally profited from pharmaceutical companies that paid Sterling Memorial for conducting illegal human trials on patients who never consented to experimental treatment." Sterling's face cycled through expressions of denial, anger, and dawning terror as he realized the scope of evidence that had been accumulated against him through months of careful surveillance and documentation. His attempts to maintain professional composure were failing as the weight of potential federal charges became clear, and he understood that he was facing not just the end of his medical career, but the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. The nursing staff members who had been watching the confrontation began to understand that they were witnessing something historic, the systematic exposure of crimes they had either participated in or failed to prevent, despite having knowledge that could have saved patient lives. Several nurses began quietly reaching for their phones, realizing that they needed legal representation for their own roles in Sterling Memorial's criminal enterprise, and that their silence had made them accessories to systematic patient murder. Dr. Williams continued her methodical presentation of evidence, pulling out patient files that documented the deliberate creation of medical complications to extend profitable hospital stays through procedures that were designed not to heal patients, but to maximize billing opportunities while ensuring that patients died from complications that appeared to be natural consequences of serious medical conditions. The files showed that Sterling Memorial physicians had been injecting patients with bacteria to cause infections that would require extended antibiotic treatment, administering incorrect medications to create adverse reactions that necessitated additional procedures, and performing unnecessary surgeries to justify extended billing cycles that continued until patients died from complications that were actually caused by deliberate medical negligence. The evidence also revealed that Sterling Memorial maintained a sophisticated computer system for tracking patient assets and insurance coverage, with algorithms designed to identify patients whose deaths would be most profitable for the hospital through maximized billing combined with minimal legal liability exposure. The most damning evidence was yet to be revealed, and what Dr. Williams showed next would prove that Sterling Memorial had been systematically murdering patients for financial gain. The tablet in Dr. Williams' hands contained video recordings that would prove Sterling Memorial had been systematically murdering patients for financial gain through a conspiracy so methodical and cruel that it would ultimately result in the largest medical murder prosecution in American legal history. The recordings, captured through hidden cameras in patient rooms, medical supply areas, and administrative offices, showed medical staff deliberately administering lethal doses of medications to elderly patients with substantial insurance coverage or significant personal assets. Dr. Sterling. Dr. Williams said, her voice maintaining clinical precision, despite the emotional weight of what she was revealing to the horrified audience of hospital staff members who were realizing they had been working in a facility that murdered patients for profit. I have video evidence of you personally administering fatal doses of morphine to patients who were showing signs of recovery. These patients were murdered because their continued survival would have limited Sterling Memorial's ability to bill for extended terminal care and death-related procedures. The accusation of deliberate murder sent shockwaves through the hospital lobby, causing security guards to instinctively step away from Sterling while nursing staff members began quietly discussing their own potential legal liability for witnessing or failing to report obvious cases of patient abuse that violated every principle of medical ethics and professional responsibility. Dr. Williams played a brief audio clip from her tablet that captured Sterling's voice, giving explicit instructions to a nurse about ensuring that Mr. Patterson doesn't survive long enough to complain about his billing or demand a second opinion on his treatment plan. The recording was clear and unmistakable, providing direct evidence of premeditated murder disguised as medical care, with Sterling's voice clearly audible as he instructed medical staff to administer medications in doses that would cause patient death. Sterling's response was immediate and desperate, his voice cracking under the strain of realizing that his most incriminating conversations had been recorded and preserved as evidence. That recording is fake. This woman is a disgruntled former employee who's trying to destroy my reputation because she was forced to retire for incompetence and medical malpractice. But Dr. Williams had anticipated this defense strategy and had prepared additional evidence that documented Sterling's role in a broader conspiracy involving multiple departments within Sterling Memorial. The oncology department had been falsifying cancer diagnoses to justify expensive chemotherapy treatments for healthy patients, while the cardiac surgery department had been performing unnecessary heart procedures that often resulted in fatal complications designed to maximize billing revenue. The evidence included internal Sterling Memorial documents that referred to these practices as revenue optimization protocols, with department heads setting monthly quotas for profitable patient deaths and awarding bonuses to staff members who exceeded their targets for billing manipulation through patient mortality management. Dr. Williams revealed that Sterling Memorial maintained 2 sets of medical records for each patient, official records that documented appropriate medical care for complex conditions with unfortunately tragic but medically unavoidable complications, and internal records that detailed the deliberate creation of complications and adverse outcomes for financial gain through systematic patient abuse. The internal records included detailed financial analyses showing the profit margins associated with different types of patient deaths, with hospital administrators calculating the optimal timing for patient mortality to maximize billing revenue while minimizing legal liability exposure through carefully orchestrated complications that appeared to be natural consequences of serious medical conditions. The evidence also showed that Sterling Memorial had developed a sophisticated patient selection system that targeted elderly individuals with substantial assets but limited family support, making them ideal victims for the hospital's murder-for-profit schemes because their deaths were unlikely to trigger family investigations or legal challenges that could expose the conspiracy. If you believe that medical professionals should be held accountable for murdering their patients, type justice in the comments below. The hospital lobby doors opened with purposeful authority as FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh entered with a team of federal agents, their timing so precise that it seemed choreographed with Dr. Williams' systematic exposure of Sterling Memorial's crimes. Agent Walsh moved with the practiced efficiency of law enforcement professionals who had been planning this moment for months, coordinating with multiple federal agencies to ensure that the operation would capture the maximum number of conspirators while preventing the destruction of evidence. Her badge clearly visible as she approached the confrontation between Dr. Sterling and Dr. Williams, Agent Walsh carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years building complex criminal cases and understood that she was about to make arrests that would result in the largest medical fraud prosecution in American history. Dr. Marcus Sterling, Agent Walsh announced, her voice carrying the full authority of federal law enforcement, while hospital staff members and patients watched in stunned silence. You are under arrest for violations of federal conspiracy, murder, and racketeering laws. Your hospital is now under federal investigation as a criminal enterprise operating under the RICO Act. Sterling looked around the lobby with wild eyes, perhaps only now understanding that his assault on Dr. Williams had been witnessed not just by hospital staff but by federal agents who had been building a comprehensive case against his entire operation through months of surveillance, evidence gathering, and coordination with international law enforcement agencies tracking medical fraud networks. The scope of the investigation was far broader than he had ever imagined, involving not just Sterling Memorial, but hospitals in 6 different states, pharmaceutical companies with international operations, and organized crime networks that specialized in medical identity theft and billing fraud schemes. Agent Walsh continued with the arrest announcement, reading federal charges that would ultimately result in life sentences for the most serious offenders. Dr. Sterling, you are charged with conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, Medicare fraud, drug trafficking, and operating a criminal enterprise under the RICO Act. The federal government has identified Sterling Memorial Hospital as the center of the largest medical fraud and patient abuse conspiracy in American history. The FBI team moved through the hospital with military precision, securing evidence and beginning the arrest process for dozens of medical professionals who had participated in or enabled Sterling Memorial's systematic patient abuse through active participation, willful blindness, or intimidation of potential whistleblowers who could have exposed the conspiracy years earlier. The investigation had been coordinated to occur simultaneously across multiple locations, preventing the destruction of evidence and ensuring that co-conspirators couldn't warn each other about the federal operation that had been months in the planning and involved coordination between multiple federal agencies, international law enforcement organizations, and medical oversight bodies. Dr. Williams had been working as an undercover federal cooperating witness for months. Her evidence gathering coordinated with federal surveillance teams that had been documenting Sterling Memorial's crimes from multiple angles through wiretaps, computer surveillance, financial investigations, and international cooperation with law enforcement agencies tracking medical fraud networks. Her medical expertise had been invaluable in helping FBI agents understand the technical aspects of the medical fraud and patient abuse they were investigating, translating complex medical procedures into evidence that could be understood by prosecutors and juries, while maintaining the chain of custody required for federal prosecution. The scope of arrests was about to reveal the true extent of Sterling Memorial's criminal network, but what agents discovered would shock even experienced federal investigators. What came next would change everything about how America views hospital safety. Within hours of Sterling's arrest, the FBI's coordinated operation had resulted in federal charges against 47 medical professionals, hospital administrators, government officials, and organized crime figures who had participated in or enabled Sterling Memorial's systematic patient abuse through a conspiracy that extended far beyond the hospital itself and involved corruption at the highest levels of Chicago's medical and political establishment. Dr. Robert Chen, Sterling Memorial's chief of cardiac surgery, was arrested at his suburban mansion while attempting to destroy computer files that contained evidence of unnecessary heart procedures performed on elderly patients for purely financial reasons, with no regard for patient safety or medical necessity. The files documented over 300 unnecessary cardiac surgeries that had resulted in patient deaths, with Chen personally profiting from each procedure through kickbacks from medical device companies that paid substantial bribes for exclusive contracts, regardless of device safety or effectiveness. Chen had been using his position to perform experimental procedures on patients who had never consented to experimental treatment, essentially using Sterling Memorial's cardiac surgery department as a testing ground for medical devices and surgical techniques that had never been approved by the FDA for human use. His personal profits from these illegal human experiments exceeded $3 million over 5 years, while patients died from complications that were actually caused by deliberately dangerous experimental procedures. Chief of Oncology Dr. Margaret Foster was taken into custody at O'Hare International Airport as she attempted to board a flight to Switzerland, where she had been transferring millions of dollars in illegal profits to offshore banking accounts that were designed to hide the proceeds of her systematic patient abuse through falsified cancer diagnoses and unnecessary chemotherapy treatments. Foster's luggage contained patient medical records that proved she had been falsifying cancer diagnoses to justify expensive chemotherapy treatments for healthy individuals, essentially murdering healthy people by convincing them they had cancer and then killing them with unnecessary cancer treatments that destroyed their immune systems and caused the very symptoms they had been told were evidence of their non-existent cancer. Her falsified diagnoses had resulted in the deaths of over 120 healthy patients who had been murdered through unnecessary chemotherapy. The arrests extended beyond Sterling Memorial to include Illinois State Medical Board Chairman Dr. Timothy Walsh, who had been receiving substantial payments from pharmaceutical companies in exchange for suppressing safety violations and whistleblower complaints that could have exposed Sterling Memorial's crimes years earlier and saved hundreds of patient lives. Walsh's corruption had enabled Sterling Memorial's crimes to continue for years without regulatory oversight or meaningful investigation, despite clear statistical evidence of patient abuse that should have triggered immediate federal intervention and hospital closure. His personal bank accounts contained over $2 million in bribes from pharmaceutical companies that had been conducting illegal human trials at Sterling Memorial. Cook County District Attorney Michael Rodriguez was arrested in his office while meeting with Sterling Memorial's legal counsel to discuss strategies for suppressing the federal investigation and intimidating potential witnesses who might testify about patient abuse they had witnessed at the hospital. The meeting had been recorded by federal surveillance equipment that had been monitoring Rodriguez's communications for months, providing evidence of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to cover up ongoing criminal activities that resulted in patient deaths. Rodriguez had personally received over $400,000 in campaign contributions from Sterling Memorial's board of directors in exchange for refusing to prosecute obvious cases of medical murder. Detective Captain Lisa Thompson of the Chicago Police Department was charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice for her role in suppressing investigations into suspicious patient deaths at Sterling Memorial, ensuring that obvious cases of medical murder were never thoroughly investigated despite clear evidence of criminal activity. Thompson had personally prevented dozens of criminal investigations that could have exposed Sterling Memorial's patient abuse years earlier, accepting substantial bribes from hospital administrators in exchange for classifying obvious murders as natural deaths or unavoidable medical complications. Her corruption had enabled Sterling Memorial to continue murdering patients for profit while avoiding criminal prosecution. The federal investigation was revealing connections to organized crime and international pharmaceutical trafficking that extended far beyond Chicago and involved criminal networks operating in multiple states and countries. The organized crime connections proved to be far more extensive than federal investigators had initially anticipated. Sterling Memorial had been serving as a hub for the Torino crime family's medical fraud operations, with hospital administrators laundering money through fake medical billing schemes while providing the criminals with access to patient information that could be used for identity theft and insurance fraud on a massive scale. Vincent Torino, Jr., the crime family's operations chief, had been using Sterling Memorial as a front for importing counterfeit medications from criminal organizations in Eastern Europe, Mexico, and Southeast Asia. These fake drugs were repackaged to look like legitimate American pharmaceuticals and sold to patients at premium prices, generating millions of dollars in profits while putting patients at risk of death from toxic ingredients and contaminated manufacturing processes. The international pharmaceutical trafficking network involved criminal organizations in 7 different countries, with Sterling Memorial serving as the primary distribution point for counterfeit medications throughout the American Midwest. Federal agents had been tracking this network for over 2 years, building cases against organized crime figures who had been using medical institutions to legitimize their criminal activities through partnerships with corrupt hospital administrators. The scope of the international conspiracy was staggering, involving fake pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities in abandoned warehouses across Eastern Europe, shipping companies that specialized in smuggling medical contraband, and corrupt customs officials who facilitated the importation of dangerous counterfeit medications that were killing patients throughout the United States. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come, as federal investigators discovered that Sterling Memorial's patient murder conspiracy was part of a broader network of corrupt hospitals that had been systematically killing patients for profit across 6 different states, with coordination and support from organized crime families that specialized in medical fraud and identity theft operations. As news of the arrest spread throughout Chicago and beyond, families who had lost loved ones at Sterling Memorial began coming forward with stories of suspicious deaths, unnecessary procedures, and medical bills that had drained their life savings while their family members died from preventable complications that were actually caused by deliberate medical negligence designed to maximize billing revenue. Carmen Rodriguez, whose 73-year-old mother had died at Sterling Memorial after routine gallbladder surgery that should have been a simple outpatient procedure, discovered that her mother had been subjected to experimental procedures without consent or knowledge. The surgery had been unnecessarily complicated to justify additional billing, and her mother had died from infections that were deliberately introduced to extend her hospital stay and generate additional revenue through extended care billing. Carmen's mother had been healthy before the surgery, with no underlying medical conditions that would have complicated a routine gallbladder removal. But Sterling Memorial physicians had deliberately infected her surgical site with antibiotic-resistant bacteria, causing complications that required weeks of expensive treatment before ultimately proving fatal. The hospital had billed Carmen's insurance company over $300,000 for treating complications that they had deliberately caused. "I kept asking the doctors why my mother wasn't getting better," Carmen said through tears during a press conference organized by federal prosecutors. "They told me she had developed unexpected complications and that they were doing everything possible to save her life. But they were the ones who were killing her. making money off her suffering while pretending to care about her recovery. The Thompson family learned that their 16-year-old son, who had been treated for a broken arm at Sterling Memorial's emergency department, had been given experimental pain medications that caused permanent kidney damage, requiring lifelong dialysis treatment. The family had been told that the complications were unavoidable, but federal investigators revealed that their son had been enrolled in an illegal pharmaceutical trial without their knowledge or consent. Jacob Thompson had been a healthy teenager, with dreams of playing college basketball when he broke his arm during a high school game. Sterling Memorial physicians had used his injury as an opportunity to test an experimental pain medication that had never been approved for use in adolescents, deliberately concealing the fact that the drug was known to cause kidney damage in young patients. "They destroyed my son's future for a few $1,000s from a pharmaceutical company," said Jacob's father, Michael Thompson. "He'll never play basketball again. He'll be on dialysis for the rest of his life because these monsters used him as a test subject without our permission." Margaret Foster, an unrelated patient who shared a name with Sterling Memorial's corrupt oncologist, had been told she had aggressive breast cancer and subjected to unnecessary chemotherapy and radiation treatments that destroyed her immune system. Federal investigators revealed that her original biopsy results had been falsified. She had never had cancer at all. "They told me I was going to die if I didn't start chemotherapy immediately," Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger and grief. "I trusted them. I believed they were trying to save my life. But they were slowly killing me with treatments for a disease I never had. They took away 2 years of my life, destroyed my health, and made me suffer through hell for money." The Williams family, no relation to Dr. Sarah Williams, discovered that their grandfather had been deliberately infected with antibiotic-resistant bacteria to extend his hospital stay and justify additional billing. He had died after weeks of unnecessary suffering, while Sterling Memorial collected over $200,000 from Medicare for his complex treatment. 81-year-old Robert Williams had been admitted to Sterling Memorial for a routine hernia repair that should have required only a brief hospital stay. Instead, he had been deliberately infected with MRSA bacteria that caused widespread complications requiring intensive care treatment that lasted for 6 weeks before ultimately proving fatal. "Grandpa was the strongest man I knew," said his grandson, David Williams. "He survived World War II, raised 6 children, worked until he was 75. But Sterling Memorial killed him for money, infected him with bacteria, and watched him suffer while they billed Medicare for every day he was dying." These families, along with hundreds of others, filed federal lawsuits against Sterling Memorial and its conspirators, seeking both financial compensation and criminal prosecution for the systematic abuse they had endured. The federal government provided legal support for victim families, ensuring that corporate lawyers couldn't intimidate them into silence through the kind of legal harassment that had protected Sterling Memorial's crimes for years. The victim impact statements revealed the true human cost of Sterling Memorial's systematic patient abuse, with families describing not just the loss of loved ones, but the ongoing trauma of discovering that their trust in medical professionals had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. But perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from the children who had survived Sterling Memorial's illegal human experiments, many of whom would suffer from permanent disabilities and health problems for the rest of their lives as a result of experimental treatments they had never consented to receive. The scope of victim impact was staggering and heartbreaking, but what came next would ensure that no other hospital could commit similar crimes. The Sterling Memorial investigation triggered comprehensive reforms in medical oversight and hospital regulation that extended far beyond Chicago and fundamentally changed how medical institutions were monitored and regulated throughout the United States. Federal agencies implemented new monitoring systems to detect patterns of patient abuse, while state medical boards across the country reviewed their own oversight procedures to prevent the kind of corruption that had enabled Sterling Memorial's crimes. The Department of Health and Human Services established new protocols for investigating suspicious mortality rates and billing patterns, with computer algorithms designed to identify hospitals that showed statistical anomalies consistent with systematic patient abuse. These systems were designed to catch future Sterling Memorial-type conspiracies before they could claim hundreds of lives, through early detection of unusual death rates, billing irregularities, and patient complaints that suggested systematic abuse. Dr. Sarah Williams was appointed as special advisor to the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Investigation Unit, where her medical expertise and investigative experience became invaluable in training federal agents to recognize and document medical crimes. Her undercover work at Sterling Memorial became a model for future investigations involving systematic healthcare fraud, with her techniques being taught to federal agents and medical oversight officials throughout the country. The new position allowed Dr. Williams to develop comprehensive training programs for federal investigators, teaching them to recognize the subtle signs of medical fraud and patient abuse that had allowed Sterling Memorial's crimes to continue for years without detection. Her expertise in both medicine and criminal investigation made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between medical knowledge and law enforcement techniques. Sterling Memorial Hospital was permanently closed and its assets seized by the federal government to compensate victim families and fund medical fraud prevention programs. The building was eventually converted into a federal healthcare facility that provided free medical care to low-income families, transforming a symbol of medical corruption into a beacon of healing and hope for the community that had been victimized by its criminal operations. The conversion of Sterling Memorial into a community health center was seen as a powerful symbol of justice and redemption, with the same building that had housed systematic patient abuse being transformed into a facility dedicated to providing ethical medical care to those who needed it most. The Federal Health Center was staffed by volunteer physicians and nurses who were committed to upholding the highest standards of medical ethics and patient care. The Illinois State Medical Board was restructured under federal oversight, with new leadership and transparent procedures designed to prevent the kind of corruption that had protected Sterling Memorial's criminal enterprise. Patient advocacy groups were given formal roles in the oversight process, ensuring that future complaints would be investigated thoroughly and transparently without the kind of cover-ups that had enabled Sterling Memorial's crimes. Medical schools across the country began incorporating ethics training based on the Sterling Memorial case, teaching future physicians to recognize and report systematic patient abuse. The case became a cornerstone of medical ethics education, ensuring that future generations of healthcare professionals would be prepared to confront corruption when they encountered it and understand their professional obligation to protect patients from abuse. The Sterling Memorial case study was integrated into medical school curricula nationwide, with students required to analyze the systematic failures that had enabled the hospital's crimes and develop strategies for preventing similar abuses in their own future practices. Medical students were taught to recognize the warning signs of institutional corruption and understand their ethical and legal obligations to report patient abuse. Hospital accreditation standards were completely overhauled in response to the Sterling Memorial scandal, with new requirements for financial transparency, patient safety monitoring, and whistleblower protection that made it much more difficult for corrupt hospitals to hide systematic patient abuse. Independent patient advocacy organizations were given mandatory access to hospital operations, ensuring that external oversight would detect problems before they could escalate to the level of systematic murder. The transformation was comprehensive and lasting, but the final chapter of justice was still being written in federal courtrooms across the country. 2 years after Dr. Sarah Williams' confrontation with Dr. Sterling in Sterling Memorial's marble lobby, federal courts had delivered justice that reflected the unprecedented scope and severity of the conspiracy's crimes against vulnerable patients through sentences that would serve as a permanent deterrent to future medical fraud and patient abuse. Dr. Marcus Sterling was convicted on 43 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and operating a criminal enterprise. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with the federal judge specifically noting that Sterling had perverted the sacred trust between physician and patient into a license for systematic murder that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The judge's sentencing statement was particularly powerful, describing Sterling's crimes as among the most heinous violations of professional trust ever documented in American medical history. The court noted that Sterling had used his position as a physician to systematically murder patients for financial gain, betraying the fundamental principles of medical care and destroying the lives of hundreds of families who had trusted him with their loved ones' care. Dr. Robert Chen received a sentence of 45 years for his role in performing unnecessary cardiac surgeries that resulted in patient deaths, with additional charges for conducting illegal human experiments without patient consent. Dr. Margaret Foster was sentenced to 38 years for falsifying cancer diagnoses and conducting illegal human trials on healthy patients, essentially murdering over 100 people through unnecessary chemotherapy treatments. The sentencing hearings became a national focal point for discussions about medical ethics and patient safety, with victim families providing powerful testimony about the impact of Sterling Memorial's crimes on their lives. The court proceedings were broadcast live, allowing the American public to understand the full scope of the conspiracy and the devastating impact on families who had lost loved ones to systematic medical murder. Illinois State Medical Board Chairman Dr. Timothy Walsh received 25 years for corruption and conspiracy, while Cook County District Attorney Michael Rodriguez was sentenced to 20 years for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to cover up ongoing criminal activities. Detective Captain Lisa Thompson received 15 years for her role in suppressing investigations that could have exposed Sterling Memorial's crimes years earlier. The federal prosecution resulted in over $200 million in financial penalties and asset seizures, with the majority of these funds dedicated to compensating victim families and establishing a memorial foundation for healthcare reform. The Sterling Memorial Victims Memorial Foundation continues to advocate for patient safety and medical ethics reform, ensuring that the lessons learned from this tragedy continue to protect future patients from similar abuse. Vincent Torino Jr. and 6 other organized crime figures were sentenced to terms ranging from 20 to 35 years for their roles in the international pharmaceutical trafficking network that had used Sterling Memorial as a distribution hub for counterfeit medications. The organized crime prosecutions were particularly significant because they demonstrated the federal government's commitment to dismantling the criminal networks that enabled systematic medical fraud. Dr. Sarah Williams received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her courage in exposing systematic medical crimes and her role in transforming healthcare oversight throughout the United States. At the awards ceremony, she spoke about the importance of medical professionals taking responsibility for policing their own profession and protecting vulnerable patients from those who would exploit their trust for financial gain. Medical professionals have a sacred obligation to protect patients from harm, Dr. Williams said during her acceptance speech. When we fail in that obligation, when we allow colleagues to abuse patients for profit, we betray everything that the medical profession represents. The patients who died at Sterling Memorial trusted us to heal them, and we failed them. We must never forget that trust, and we must never stop fighting to protect it. These stories of justice inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages are reaching. Carmen Rodriguez, who lost her mother to Sterling Memorial's criminal enterprise, became a leading advocate for medical transparency and patient rights, working with federal legislators to strengthen hospital oversight and patient protection laws. She testified before Congress about the need for stronger oversight of hospital operations and continues to work with victim families seeking justice for medical abuse. Carmen's advocacy work led to the passage of the Patient Protection and Medical Transparency Act, which required hospitals to publicly report mortality rates, complication rates, and financial relationships with pharmaceutical companies. The legislation also strengthened whistleblower protections for medical professionals and created independent patient advocacy positions within hospital oversight agencies. The Sterling Memorial case fundamentally changed how federal authorities investigate healthcare fraud, with Dr. Williams' undercover methodology becoming a standard tool for exposing systematic medical crimes. Her work proved that sometimes the most effective way to fight institutional corruption is to become invisible within the system itself, gathering evidence from the inside while maintaining the patience and determination necessary to build comprehensive cases against criminal enterprises. Medical licensing boards in all 50 states implemented new oversight procedures based on the Sterling Memorial investigation, with mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious mortality rates and systematic monitoring of physician billing patterns. The changes made it much more difficult for corrupt physicians to hide systematic patient abuse behind professional credentials and institutional authority. The international pharmaceutical trafficking network, exposed through the Sterling Memorial investigation, led to coordinated law enforcement operations in 7 countries, resulting in the dismantling of criminal organizations that had been manufacturing and distributing counterfeit medications worldwide. The international cooperation demonstrated the global nature of medical fraud and the need for coordinated international responses to protect patients from systematic abuse. Sterling Memorial's marble lobby, where Dr. Sterling assaulted Dr. Williams and triggered the exposure of the largest medical fraud conspiracy in American history, now houses a memorial to the patients who lost their lives to medical greed. The memorial serves as a reminder that healthcare must be guided by healing rather than profit, and that the medical profession has a fundamental obligation to protect patients from those who would exploit their vulnerability for financial gain. The memorial includes the names of all patients who died as a result of Sterling Memorial's systematic abuse, along with a permanent exhibit explaining how the conspiracy was exposed and what changes were made to prevent similar abuses in the future. Medical students from universities throughout the Chicago area visit the memorial as part of their ethics training, ensuring that future physicians understand their obligation to protect patients from institutional corruption. The most important lesson from this story is that one person's courage to stand up against institutional corruption can transform entire systems and save countless lives. As evening fell over the federal courthouse where so much justice had been served, Dr. Sarah Williams prepared to return home, where her family waited with stories of their own day's work in medicine and law. The memory of Sterling's assault had long since faded, but the meaning of that moment, when she chose to expose systematic murder disguised as medical care, remained as vivid as ever. Sterling had thought his medical degree made him untouchable, that his position would protect him from consequences, that violence would silence those who challenged his authority. He was wrong on every count, because he encountered someone who understood that some principles are worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost. The transformation of Sterling Memorial, from a symbol of medical corruption into a beacon of ethical healthcare, demonstrated that institutions can be redeemed through the courage of individuals who refuse to accept systematic abuse as inevitable. Dr. Williams's work proved that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises can be dismantled when good people refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. The medical profession itself was transformed by the Sterling Memorial scandal, with new emphasis on ethical training, patient advocacy, and professional responsibility for reporting abuse. Medical schools began requiring courses in recognizing and reporting institutional corruption, while licensing boards implemented new oversight mechanisms designed to detect systematic patient abuse before it could claim innocent lives. The federal legislation inspired by the Sterling Memorial case established new criminal penalties for medical professionals who abuse their positions to harm patients, with sentences comparable to those imposed for other forms of organized crime. The legislation recognized that systematic patient abuse represents a fundamental violation of society's trust in medical institutions and must be punished accordingly. Hospital accreditation agencies implemented new standards for ethical oversight and patient protection, with mandatory external auditing designed to detect the kind of systematic abuses that had flourished at Sterling Memorial. The new standards required hospitals to demonstrate not just medical competence, but ethical integrity and commitment to patient welfare above financial considerations. The Sterling Memorial Victims Memorial Foundation established scholarship programs for medical students who demonstrated exceptional commitment to medical ethics and patient advocacy. The scholarships were designed to support future physicians who would carry forward the lessons learned from the Sterling Memorial tragedy and ensure that patient safety remained the highest priority in medical care. The legacy of Dr. Sarah Williams's courage continues to protect patients throughout the United States and beyond, with her investigative techniques being used by federal agencies worldwide to detect and prevent medical fraud before it can claim innocent lives. Her example demonstrates that sometimes The most powerful response to institutional corruption is the quiet determination to document the truth until justice becomes inevitable. The Sterling Memorial case established precedents that continue to guide federal prosecutions of medical fraud and patient abuse, with courts recognizing that systematic abuse of patients represents a form of organized crime that deserves the harshest possible penalties. The case demonstrated that medical degrees and professional credentials provide no immunity from criminal prosecution when physicians betray their fundamental obligation to protect patient welfare. The international cooperation triggered by the Sterling Memorial investigation led to the establishment of new protocols for detecting and prosecuting cross-border medical fraud, with law enforcement agencies sharing information and coordinating operations to dismantle criminal networks that exploit vulnerable patients for financial gain. Medical device companies and pharmaceutical manufacturers implemented new oversight procedures designed to prevent the kind of corrupt relationships that had enabled Sterling Memorial's crimes, with mandatory disclosure of all financial relationships with healthcare providers and stricter monitoring of experimental procedures and drug trials. The transformation of American healthcare oversight in response to the Sterling Memorial scandal saved countless lives by establishing systems designed to detect and prevent systematic patient abuse before it could escalate to the level of murder. The reforms demonstrated that institutional corruption can be defeated through the combination of individual courage, federal determination, and comprehensive systematic change. The story of Dr. Sarah Williams and Sterling Memorial Hospital continues to inspire medical professionals, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens who understand that protecting the vulnerable from institutional abuse requires constant vigilance and the courage to act when confronted with systematic injustice. Justice doesn't always move quickly, but when good people refuse to give up, it moves inevitably toward truth and accountability. The Sterling Memorial case proved that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises can be dismantled when individuals with expertise and determination refuse to accept corruption as inevitable and commit themselves to documenting the truth until justice becomes unavoidable. Some battles are won not through force, but through the quiet courage of refusing to be broken by institutional intimidation and the patient determination to gather evidence until the truth becomes undeniable. Sarah Williams showed us that sometimes the most powerful response to systematic abuse is maintaining professional integrity until truth prevails over corruption and justice is finally served to those who thought themselves above the law. The medical profession emerged from the Sterling Memorial scandal with a renewed commitment to ethical practice and patient protection, demonstrating that even institutions corrupted by greed and criminal activity can be redeemed through the efforts of individuals who refuse to accept abuse as normal and commit themselves to transforming systems that have lost their way. The federal investigation of Sterling Memorial Hospital established new standards for prosecuting medical fraud and patient abuse, proving that systematic exploitation of vulnerable patients represents a form of organized crime that deserves prosecution under racketeering statutes and punishment, with sentences comparable to other forms of murder and conspiracy. Until the next story that proves courage can change everything, remember that justice depends on individuals who refuse to remain silent when confronted with systematic abuse and who understand that protecting the vulnerable from institutional corruption requires both personal courage and collective determination to transform systems that have betrayed their fundamental purpose. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and accountability. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth to transform systems built on lies.